First, Joe, thank you for joining us, and thanks all the listeners out there and viewers for joining us. If you're not familiar with Anthony and myself, this is a live Into the Ether podcast recording. We do these every week. We actually do two every week, but this is actually our first at a conference live. That of course, was going to be in person at some point, so I'm definitely excited for this. But Joe, thanks for taking the time. It's been a great conference so far, kind of a first stab at a Ethereal Virtual Conference. But, Joe, I don't think you really need an intro, to be honest. But, what I would like to ask you kind of as a kickoff question is, we know you're a co-founder of Ethereum. You've been around the space since the beginning. But what I would like to know is kind of like your story of how you initially actually got involved in the Ethereum project. Like, how did you hook up with Vitalik and this team that kind of launched it initially?
Cool. So first, thanks, Eric. Thanks, Anthony, for having me on your show at our conference. It's interesting embedding there. And just wanted to thank you guys for the awesome work that you guys do for the ecosystem. It is just an incredibly invaluable resource to me, and I know many people who listen to you very regularly. Gets me out of the office or out of the apartment to get some exercise. I feel like I'm working when I'm listening to you guys and walking around.
Nice. It's good to hear.
So,
Awesome.
yeah. Sure. So I got into the blockchain ecosystem very early 2011. Just read some stuff, ended up reading Satoshi's white paper and got hooked virtually instantly. And was pretty convinced that it was going to change everything, and didn't really do much other than obsess about it all day, every day, reading everything I could. And I wasn't really interested in starting a business in the space because I just felt it was too early, that lots of immature attempts would get washed away, which pretty much happened. And I was just lucky enough to be visiting my family Christmas 2013. Vitalik and I are both from Toronto, and I ended up speaking to Anthony Diorio, who was close to Vitalik, and he told me about this meetup where Vitalik was going to talk about this new thing that he had constructed. And I met with Vitalik on January 1st, 2014, spoke with him for, I don't know, maybe it was 20 minutes. And he sent me the white paper, and I just stayed close to that group over the next few days and weeks. And we ended up, I ended up getting invited to a place, a house in Miami, where a bunch of us congregated and effectively organized the Ethereum project. It was in advance of the North American Bitcoin conference where Vitalik was presenting. And so we sort of structured the early phases of the project and watched Vitalik essentially deliver the paper, announce the system to a pretty massive crowd at that conference. So right place, right time, got lucky.
Yeah, I remember watching that talk he gave at the Miami Bitcoin conference. And Joe, you and I kind of go way back when it comes to the EtherX days and stuff like that. We were talking a little bit back then as well. But, I think this concept, at least to me at the time, was fascinating. But I don't think I could have ever really imagined what it's turned into today. What do you think about that? Like, when you look back at when you first heard about this and like got invested, it's hard to imagine like how big these things maybe could get. But, did you imagine it would turn into what it has at this point in time?
Well, I think I have a pretty good imagination, and I was starting to imagine things after reading the Bitcoin white paper. I was a technologist, did a lot of work in robotics, machine vision, neural nets, and also did work in the financial space. And I was pretty disappointed in how the world was proceeding at that point. Got disturbed around, 9/11 was a little bit disturbing to some people. And the few years after that, leading to the financial crisis, was differently and still profoundly disturbing. And I really didn't see a natural way for our economy, global society to escape the cascading collapse that I saw that usually punctuates the end of a 70-year global debt supercycle. And so when I read the Bitcoin white paper, I felt that there was a chance that instead of complaining about stuff and protesting, I wasn't a protester, but people were occupying everything and protesting, and that was a good activity, but it wasn't a constructive activity. And I just felt that with software, which was my life pretty much, we could build alternative systems and sort of grow our way potentially out of the mess. And here we are at the inflection point, and we might have a canvas on which we can start painting those solutions a little faster.
Yeah, it's certainly interesting times that we're living in for sure. I'm sure everyone's heard that lately. Yeah, Joe, that's a great background.
Let me just also qualify that by saying that, oh my God, it is absolutely astonishing how fast, how broad and deep all of this has unfolded. So yeah, it's stunning.
Yeah, it seems like Ethereum's everywhere these days. Cool. I wanted to talk to you a bit about a bit about the history of ConsenSys, kind of like what you have learned over the past 4 years when it comes to ConsenSys, and kind of has your vision for the company changed from when you first started the company to today?
Well, essentially, I started ConsenSys basically just to continue the vision and mission of the Ethereum project. It was about adoption, education early on, doing cool shit to gain attention, running lots of experiments. So we learned how to build decentralized applications. We learned what sort of developer tooling and infrastructure we needed, and we built a lot of that. We learned how to do business more recently. We weren't paying much attention to doing business in the first couple or so years, and to create companies in a decentralized protocols ecosystem. We started with the intention to be a software product company, but we pretty much had to do whatever it took. So we did a lot of education work. ConsenSys Academy came from that. We ran a bunch of education events before ConsenSys Academy even. We got a lot of calls from companies and governments and banks and central banks to help them understand blockchain and Ethereum, and that evolved into our solutions practice or our professional services consulting group. And we've learned a tremendous amount about what companies want and need, and we've built a lot of products now because we got paid effectively to build them or to build on products that we were already building. We ended up taking the approach of being a venture studio for quite a while, just because there's no way we could design the decentralized protocol ecosystem top down, and we just needed to attract lots of very smart technologists and entrepreneurs to explore the solution space and figure out all together what needed to be built. And I think we've been pretty successful in that. And so a bunch of those projects, the ones that have really gained traction, are now the backbone of what we are today. So ConsenSys is essentially a software product company. It's a core tech stack company where we've got projects like Pegasus or Hyperledger Besu and products around that, and Infura and MetaMask and Truffle and Codify, Commerce and Decentralized Finance Group. And all of that represents essentially the backbone of what we're starting to think of as a blockchain operating system. So we've got this one group called ConsenSys, which is that it's a software product company. And over the last year or so, we've sort of split our activities to that group and another group that we're calling ConsenSys Investments, which will which currently manages our pretty sizable portfolio. Projects that we've incubated and spinning out now, projects we've invested in, and it will continue to do new investing.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah, there's been plenty of kind of, I guess you could call them home runs that ConsenSys has had. A lot of Ethereum people have used like pretty much, the most popular ConsenSys products like MetaMask and, Infura and things like that without even realizing. So yeah, it's been really great to see all those products being used by a lot of different people. So there was a lot of hype around the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, or the EEA, in 2017. Do you think this kind of alliance has lived up to the promise that was first envisioned from when it was first announced?
Well, it was pretty spectacular when it came out. It really had an impact on the ecosystem. And has it lived up to the hype? I think it has. It's hard to see that from the outside. But from the inside, there's just an amazing amount of really high value activity. So on the inside, there are a bunch of working groups. There's a technical spec working group. There's cross-chain interoperability. There's digital ID. There's trusted execution. There's testing and certification, legal advisory. There's a bunch of special interest groups, AI, financial, real estate, security, etc. And really interesting, there's something called the Ethereum Mainnet Working Group, which spun up fairly recently. So first, the EEA was, one of its major missions was about specifications. It's about defining what to build around Ethereum clients and staying, like, not modifying the Ethereum clients, but what to build around them to make them enterprise friendly. And that has been incredibly valuable to make Ethereum so much more accessible to enterprise. Interestingly, an organization called the Hyperledger Foundation took notice as the EEA spec and ConsenSys's Pegasus client started to look really promising. And we forged pretty strong ties between the EEA and the Hyperledger Foundation. We contributed the code base. It's now called Hyperledger Besu, and that's really opening up a ton of doors around the world. So behind the scenes, you may not see this, but we're working with so many companies and governments and banks and central banks. And many of them are using our version of Ethereum or Quorum, a very similar version of Enterprise Ethereum. So it's that sort of activity that maybe doesn't make a lot of headlines. The EEA Mainnet Working Group is headed up by Taj Dean of the Ethereum Foundation. A lot of participation recently from the Ethereum Foundation. It's been really great building bridges between the two organizations. John Wolpert from ConsenSys is also heading up that group, and the EEA is targeting its sites, or already has, on mainnet. As Mr. Wolpert likes to describe it, it's trying to make mainnet friendly for enterprise, and enterprise ready. Oh, I think it's mainnet ready for enterprise and the enterprise ready for mainnet. So have you guys heard of something called the Baseline protocol?
Yeah, I saw that announced a few weeks ago, actually. Yeah.
Cool. So let me just do a really quick précis of that. So Baseline is a project that we and Ernst & Young have been building out with some support from Microsoft. It essentially uses public mainnet Ethereum as a global shared reference frame. So you have all these different systems, essentially sources of truth inside organizations, whether they're blockchains or databases. And what Ethereum is now becoming in this use case is a reference frame that can enable agreements or transactions or business processes to be linked across a whole bunch of different counterparties in different organizations. and it's all done using zero knowledge proof technology, so that no actual information is put on mainnet except the linkages. And so nobody can figure out anything that's going on unless you're on the right side of the firewall and you know what's going on. And so these business processes can proceed, and everybody can be kept in sync. Essentially, it's likely to represent a revolution in how sort of message busing between organizations can happen. So, really exciting stuff, and the EEA is driving a lot of that work.
Yeah, that's exciting stuff. And Paul Brody and his team over at EY are doing a lot of interesting things as well. Definitely suggest people go check that out. I think, Anthony was just asking you about kind of like the history of ConsenSys and what you've learned and kind of where you guys are positioned now. I want to shift a little bit to kind of the future, right? Like we've all learned a lot in this space in the last few years. And, ConsenSys is, to me, a very besides the Ethereum Foundation, maybe with the Ethereum Foundation, one of the most important companies when it comes to, helping this ecosystem flourish and be successful. Anthony mentioned a lot of good projects you guys have that people use on a daily basis. I want to start with, before we kind of dive into kind of where you guys are positioning to the future, how should the outside kind of look at the ConsenSys has been scaling back its employee base a little bit recently and stuff like that. How should kind of external viewers to the company kind of take these moves and kind of understand this and digest it?
So it's a company responding to economic realities. So there were structural reasons we had to make an adjustment. Part of it was our expectation of pretty massive global economic uncertainty. We had revenue forecasts for 2020 that were nearly double that of 2019, and we pretty much have to scale that back significantly. So we think we're going to be flat compared to 2019. And there are other structural reasons which will likely become apparent in the news at some point in the not too distant future. So maybe you guys can draw lines between some data points. So the bottom line is that ConsenSys is both a leaner and a much stronger company than we've ever been. We moved from being a bunch of loosely coupled projects 18 months ago with their own goals to a single integrated company with shared direction and deep alignment across the teams. So companies working together like a finely oiled rugby squad. It's we tussle a lot, but everybody's pulling in the same direction.
Yeah, that's good. And what would you say shift-wise and trends that you've seen in the ecosystem is ConsenSys starting to focus on? Are there a couple like core aspects that it's like, hey, this is clearly going to be very important in the future of Ethereum that, we for sure want to make sure we build teams out around and really focus and dedicate resources to?
So as I indicated, for the first few years, we're just trying to do whatever it took to open up an ecosystem and drive growth. And now we're focusing on competing in that ecosystem because so many are rushing in. We've done a lot of things. We drove a bunch of ICO activity. We learned a ton from that. Ended up building our Codify Activate platform. So Codify is commerce and decentralized finance, and the Activate platform arose from us working really closely with regulators to help them understand our space and to help us understand them, so that we could issue tokens, whether they're utility tokens or tokenized securities, and do it properly. And so it's really all about how you sell them, how you market them. And so that's one aspect. We'll certainly get back to selling lots of tokens. That was a big part of a previous phase of the company, and we're excited to get back to that pretty significantly. Scale Network is a project that is making use of the Activate platform, and essentially you can sell a utility token And if you do your legal homework and you ensure that you're not selling it in huge quantities to speculators, and you're doing certain things based on guidance from the SEC, where you're essentially proving that the buyers of your token are using it before you open it up for trading, then you've got a clean utility token. And so we're looking to do a bunch of that work going forward. Trends are definitely more in the financialization direction. We were very focused on the ethos of building. We did a lot of biddling and facilitated a lot of biddling, and that was the message we wanted to project, because it really is all about the developers in our ecosystem. The more developers, the better our developers are, the better the tooling they have, the faster this ecosystem will grow. And so what we are anticipating is that the biddling will become very intimate with the governance, with the rolling out of different networks, either on Ethereum or connected to Ethereum or adjacent to Ethereum, and the financialization, because the tokens are all part of the governance going forward. And so we already pay a lot of attention to DeFi, and we'll pay a lot more attention to the financial aspects of the ecosystem, or financialization of software, essentially. And so projects like we're building staking as a service, essentially in collaboration with the Ethereum Foundation. And interestingly, it looks like it's going to be a big business. We're building infrastructure for it, for people, but staking as a service in a more generalized format is something that a lot of organizations, institutions are interested in. So we're having commercial discussions with them.
Yeah, I want to get into E2 and staking, and I'll go there soon. And that's an interesting point you bring up there. One thing you brought up DeFi. What are your thoughts on the DeFi trend? I mean, I think early on in Ethereum's life, this vision of world computer and Web3 was very prevalent. It seems like it was kind of like, oh shit, I don't know if we're quite ready for that yet. DeFi kind of has taken over the narratives in the last few years. I guess the first part of this question is just, what are your thoughts in general on DeFi and kind of where it can go in the next 1 to 2 years, 5 years, whatever it might be. And do you still believe in this kind of world computer Web3 narrative that was kind of originally envisioned?
So it started with DeFi. It was Vitalik's initial intention to make it easy to create your own cryptocurrency. And originally you had to fork Bitcoin and convince a whole lot of people to care about your new system, and that would take months or never. And essentially, we printed a bunch of shirts for an April 2014 conference in Toronto, and on the back we had 4 lines of code that was essentially Bitcoin, and another shirt had 4 lines of code that was Dropbox, and another was I think decentralized Twitter or something like that, uncensorable Twitter. There are a few of them, and so that narrative is old and very prominent. And Ethereum was always the computationally expressive blockchain system, so it was always about being a world computer. And so you can think of Ethereum and decentralized protocol systems that it will interoperate with over the next 100 years or however long, as a new trust foundation. And on top of that new trust foundation, we have we're building a financial plumbing layer. It's a financial plumbing layer that that can be a global settlement layer for digital assets, and everything is going to be tokenized. Some of them will be permissionless digital assets like Ether, creating economic bandwidth, or permissionless economic bandwidth, and some will be permissioned, and that's perfectly fine. And on top of this financial plumbing layer, which is incredibly exciting. It's basically removing the priests from intermediating our access to the monetary gods or the financial gods, because everybody's going to be able to use their own magic internet money Legos or build their own magic internet money Legos or fork some and connect them to others. And so it really opens up the system and lays it bare for us to build what we want, build our own bank or lender or whatever. And on this new financial infrastructure, many new industries will be built and many existing industries will be re-architected. So we'll see lots of collaboration networks, tokenized, with their own embedded tokenized governance. I think all of this is going to lead to much more granular governance in the world. So essentially, we're in a world where we have these governments that make decisions, two-party governments or one-party governments, and they make decisions for all the people, and they don't serve most of the people very well. A narrow set of interests essentially follows their own needs. And with more granular governance, we're going to be able to essentially create our own money in different projects. You can create your own token on your project and define your own goals and follow your own philosophies and execute your own agenda. And so I think that it is going to be a much more empowering future where people and smaller organizations have much greater economic and political agency.
Yeah, the token governance is probably Anthony and I's number one favorite topic when it comes to these podcasts. So I'm sure we could have a 5-hour talk on that in general. But I want to shift quickly to E2. You kind of hinted at it a little bit about, how ConsenSys is planning to position itself for E2. Obviously, this, in my opinion, is the next big wave coming. There's a lot of infrastructure being built out, education, services, and stuff. I guess, are you getting excited for the transition to finally be here? And can you talk to how ConsenSys is positioning itself to kind of, be a part of ETH2?
Yeah, I've been excited for Ethereum 2 since about January 2014. Literally the first time we talked about sharding was in that house in Florida in January 2014. We knew that we had to build something that was sort of a prototype that worked. And the prototype has turned out to be incredibly powerful and actually remarkably scalable. I think Ethereum 1 could actually become very scalable, but Ethereum 2 is the right direction. And it's not, it's all Ethereum, really. Ethereum, you can think of Ethereum 2 as essentially a DeFi application on top of Ethereum 1. It's a bond. It is anchored on Ethereum 1. It provides yield for people who want to stake some of their Ether so that we can launch Ethereum 2. And it's an organic evolution from Ethereum 1. Ethereum 1 becomes stateless. Ethereum 2 is already going to be stateless. Ethereum 1 provides the staking infrastructure. Ethereum 2, when the heartbeats of the beacon chain is launched, can reach back in time and finalize blocks on Ethereum 1, so creating a sort of bi-directional linkage. And we'll see Ethereum 1 applications, ZK rollups, optimistic rollups, needing the data availability that Ethereum 2 phase 1 provides when that comes online. So we'll see that tendril move over. When we have phase 2 execution environments on Ethereum 2, Ethereum 1 basically gets snapshotted and becomes a phase 2 shard execution environment essentially on Ethereum 2. And so for developers, I think it's going to be very, very smooth. It's going to feel like an operating system upgrade. you're going to either keep running your Ethereum 2 application as it is, if it's just fine in the Ethereum 2 context, or you can upgrade to some of the new capabilities. It will essentially be like an organic transition to more capabilities. And I think there are a lot of people that are interested in creating FUD around composability, etc. Bottom line is, we're not going to do dumb things. We're going to solve problems, and it's not going to be trivial. But I expect that the developer experience is going to initially be extremely similar, and just like operating systems upgrade every few years, developers will be able to look forward to new features.
Yeah, it's definitely, to me, the most interesting time in the whole. I mean, watching everything kind of like go crazy in 16, 17 and see people come into the community was a lot of fun. But I'm with you. Like, I've been waiting for this since the beginning too. I think we all have. And I think it's going to really just like wake people up when it gets here. There's so many skeptics out there that just don't think it's going to happen. And, it's there. Like, we're all the test nets out there running validators and nodes. What are your thoughts on? One of the big questions is, how much stake are we going to see? So there's 110 million ETH in total right now. Kind of as more stake, the rewards dip down to kind of like find the sweet spot between stake and issuance. What do you think we're going to see? Phase 0, 1, 2. Phase 2, of course, is like when things are really going live. And does ConsenSys plan to stake, kind of part of their ETH holdings as well?
So I haven't thought too much about it. I will do some. ConsenSys may. Haven't talked about it in a company context. I certainly will personally. And I don't know, I don't really think about or haven't been thinking about much more than building. Haven't been thinking about financial strategies at all. But this is now about investing in building. So it moves into my sweet spot, at least, and probably the company's sweet spot.
Awesome. So just shifting gears a little bit here to a different topic. There's been a lot of talk about these so-called Ethereum killers, or as Eric likes to call them, Ethereum attempted murderers. It seems like a new chain is popping up every other day. And I just wanted to ask you, like, what your general thoughts were, and kind of like, do these chains worry you at all?
So I guess it's rational for VCs to invest in these projects. I kind of think of, back to that operating system metaphor. It's sort of like trying to create a new operating system and compete with Mac OS 10 or Windows if you're starting a new protocol. There's just so much infrastructure out there. There's so many developers. It's an enormous climb. And all these projects are really pretty tiny compared to our ecosystem. So it's rational for VCs to invest in some of these projects. I think they either invest in Ethereum projects, or projects building on Ethereum, or projects building on Bitcoin, or they take a flyer on some new protocol that was fashionable a while ago. It's not very fashionable of late. I guess there's some notable exceptions, but VC coins or professor coins are unlikely to be successful unless they have some magical niche. The ethos is essentially wrong. So they start centralized. They're invested in, promoted by people who are just interested in making money. Sure, some of the VCs may have a bit of the ethos of this ecosystem, but they're VCs. They've got LPs. They're making very financial decisions. And so if they can buy into a project and get liquidity fairly quickly, make some money, then some of those decisions probably make sense. I think journalists totally distort the perspective of the ecosystem. So it's not useful for a journalist to say, hey, look at those Ethereum researchers or people building an app on Ethereum or Bitcoin. Wow, that looks like hard work, but aren't they doing great? It's just so much more valuable to them to create clickbait. And this 11-person project with a 4-node network running P of A is going to kill Ethereum. So there's a good reason why all these narratives are out there. So Matteo Leibowitz, you guys probably are aware of the distribution quadrilemma. So he basically indicated that it's going to be incredibly difficult for a startup project to take the place of Ethereum or Bitcoin, just because we happened at a moment in time when securities regulators around the world were not watching, and we became sufficiently decentralized, and they're simply, what they have to do is sell tokens broadly and equitably. They need to raise enough money to build the project and continue the project. They need to build a community, incentivize growth in their community. And in order to do that, they pretty much have to get tokens in the hands of the community, and they have to promise that those tokens are going to appreciate by the agency of some group. And so by definition, that's a security. They're selling a security, so it's not going to be broad and equitable distribution. And it's going to be like climbing a cliff, I believe. Am I concerned? No, we just have a lot of building to do. But it's also, it's kind of great. I mean, so it's also important to say that these activities are incredibly valuable. There are teams out there that are very smart, that are taking different approaches. They're exploring the solution space, and that's wonderful and necessary. There are other teams that are, being silly and copying white papers, and that's just kind of wasteful activity. And it's an attempt to opportunistically carve out a little bit of value from somebody else's work. But essentially, all this great work that other projects are doing is being done out in the open. I guess Dfinity is a notable exception. But we all go to the same conferences, and we're all sharing the same ideas. And Ethereum's a massive gravity well, and all that valuable stuff flows down into our gravity well. And we don't even have to go to those other people's conference. They all come to our conference and tell us about their great ideas. And so I'm not concerned.
Yeah, there used to be this meme on Bitcoin where it's like, oh, everything being built by these other chains will be, put into Bitcoin, and Bitcoin will be able to be this. Yeah. It's quite an old meme. Yeah. So was I back in 2013, and then I discovered Ethereum, and then Ethereum's been absorbing everything, and it's like, okay, well, Ethereum is the thing. All these other chains can, as you said, they've got great teams, they've got great tech, but a lot of that stuff will just be, Ethereum will just absorb. It doesn't have that, I guess, Bitcoiner mindset of like this really conservative approach to, not really upgrading, not eating everything like Ethereum does. So yeah, it's definitely cool to see that. And as you said, we all go to the same conferences. We're all friends, the teams and everything. We all share ideas, all open source. It's just, yeah, there's no moat in that. The moat is the community at the end of the day.
Yep.
Yeah. So I guess the last thing,
we'll all end up working together. I was just going to say, I think we're all going to end up working together. We'll explore the solution space, build in parallel. There will be a lot of convergence. There'll be convergence of enterprise onto decentralized systems, and lots of these decentralized systems will, I think, find different niches and connect to one another. And the World Wide Web will become increasingly decentralized. Yeah,
I totally agree there. Okay. All right. Shifting away from the Ethereum killers, just to wrap up here, I guess like Ethereal Summit's coming to an end now. It's been going for a couple of days. It's been a lot of different talks, a lot of exciting talks. I unfortunately missed a lot due to the time zone that I'm in, but I'll be catching up I just wanted to get your general thoughts on the kind of virtual conference and what you think, is good about it, or what you kind of think's bad about it, and how I guess it can be improved as time goes on.
So we didn't have a lot of time between when we decided to go virtual and the actual event. We had great ambitions for this event. We wanted it to be quite interactive. We wanted it to feel like you're actually at an event and schmoozing. We wanted to use the technology. We didn't want to sort of bring a typical conference over into this medium. And so it turns out that that's really hard. Turns out, we're doing some stuff with Capture, and we wanted to tokenize a bunch of things. It's going to take quite a while for us to be able to use VR and really make it seem like a schmoozy conference, if ever. So we had concerns. We wanted to do a bunch in VR, but there are all these issues about people dropping in and saying obnoxious things in crowds. And so we went really light on that. So we ended up going with what we felt would be high production values, where Ethereum was always about not being too technical. It was focusing on philosophy, sociology, politics, etc., art, music, and so we tried to stick to some of that. This one's actually a lot more technical, just because ETH2 and DeFi are such big topics, and this COVID thing, as many tech companies are finding out, is not only shedding a bunch of aspects of the legacy economy, like going into work, but it's sort of accelerating adoption of technology for so many people who otherwise just wouldn't have reason to. And so it is enabling. So ConsenSys has been a remote first company for quite a long time. We're very comfortable with it. And if this keeps up for quite a while, we will have time to make this online remote first experience better and better. It'll require quarantine to last a bunch longer, and it's looking like in some forms that might happen. But with respect to tokenization and just getting people really savvy with being online, if we did this a few months from now, and we're actually planning on doing a few of these things every few weeks, we'll have much smaller, more focused little ethereals. But if we start offering wallets and tokenization of these events, we can drag the whole world kicking and screaming into the future potentially.
Yeah, they've been. I like the idea of these summits, especially in such a digital space. Like, it's always wondered why we haven't quite got here. Everyone just travels around the world, and it's fun to connect in person and stuff, obviously. But I'm excited to see where this goes. And Joe, just one kind of final question here. I've always kind of laughed when I ever got you on this episode. I'm going to ask you this question. So we recently saw Paul Tudor Jones kind of come out and say that he was going to buy Bitcoin. So one of the largest hedge fund managers in the world. And in that, he mentioned that,
by the way.
Yeah. So in that, he mentioned that they're going to be buying Bitcoin futures, right? You're kind of famous in the Ethereum space for an interview you gave on Bloomberg once, where you said that Ethereum futures or ETH futures were coming in quote unquote weeks, not months. It's been a lot of weeks since that comment. Kind of what is the state in your mind of futures? You were recently talking about it. Just kind of, can you talk about that comment and just, do you think we're close at this point?
Comment? Days, not weeks. Just kidding. Don't listen to me. I'm not reliable at all. But if there were futures coming, they should be deliverable futures. They should be part of making the global IT infrastructure much more granular and free market based. Producers and consumers need those kinds of hedging mechanisms. So my fingers are crossed.
Nice, nice, cool. Well, that's all we had. I just want to give you an opportunity to, kind of say a final thing to, the viewers out there to wrap up Ethereal at this point. Just kind of, what do you want to say?
Well, first, thanks guys for doing this. Very exciting to be on your show. I guess hope everybody enjoys their quarantine. We should all try to get lots of rest. I feel like the 20th century is starting in earnest very soon. I don't believe it really arrived for the first 20 years of this century. We're sort of playing the old, the dying stages of the old patterns. And in the midst of this cascading global economic collapse, we're essentially shedding lots of the legacy baggage as we speak. So I do feel like it may feel like a bit of a clash of civilizations over the next few years, but the path is being cleared. It feels like we are heading more rapidly to a more decentralized future. So, lots of work ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you first and foremost for coming on our show and allowing us to do this on the summit. It's been great, and we can't thank you enough. And keep up the good work.
Cool.
Yep.
Thanks,
thank you,
guys.
Joe.
I should probably take this moment to invite everybody back to the next Ethereals, which will be coming pretty soon in a much smaller format, and say thank you to Amy, Travis, Jesse, Sean, the whole team for putting together a very smooth first Ethereal Virtual Summit. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, everybody, for coming.